Introducing G-Core Managed Kubernetes, the ultimate solution for streamlined Kubernetes management. Experience support for bare metal nodes and a robust 99.9 uptime SLA at no extra cost. Provision Kubernetes clusters effortlessly with a single click using their intuitive dashboard, API, or Terraform. Seamlessly integrate with G-Core external DNS and easily provision block volume storage for your requirements. And of course, stay up to date with the latest Kubernetes versions. Plus, they have an exclusive offer just for you. Click the G-Core link in the show notes and use promo code CLOUDCAST and receive €100 credit to try G-Core services today. That's promo code CLOUDCAST to receive €100 credit on your G-Core services today.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. July is moving along, and if you're listening to this, which I don't think he does, but if you're listening to this, happy birthday to my dad. Turned 81 on the 8th, so day late, but recording on the 8th. So happy birthday to my dad. Today's Sunday Perspective, we are going to talk a little bit about the thing that has sort of been the talk of technology for the last couple of days, and that's, I guess, Meta's Threads, Instagram Threads, Threads, the sort of Twitter clone, replacement for Twitter, if you will. And I don't want to talk about the application per se. Most of us have only been playing around with it for a couple of days and just kind of seeing what it does and kind of experimenting with it. But as I was sort of digging into it a little bit the last couple of days, it occurred to me that it is sort of the perfect analogy for anybody that has to explain app migration or app modernization to an executive or to a colleague. And I say that in the context of, yes, people have been doing that sort of stuff for a while. It is the one thing that we do get questions about all the time on the, as far as like write-ins and stuff from people going like, hey, can you do more shows about app modernization? And it's one of those things that we oftentimes respond back to people of like, yes, we'll do the best we can to try and give you useful app modernization discussions with people. And we get various people that kind of come in and talk to us about it. But it's also one of those things that we often tell people, well, it's a really hard thing to sort of narrow down into 30 minutes because, most app modernizations are pretty unique. Yes, you could say, well, if we move from, some well-known thing to the next version, that's one thing. But, if somebody said like, hey, we want to replace our ERP system, how would we do that with a modernization type of thing? It's a more complicated thing to explain. It's a lot of like, well, but, what if, it depends, kind of a lot of consultant speak. And so it's oftentimes difficult to do. But it dawned on me in the same way that when ChatGPT came out, it became the conversation starter, the proof point, the easy demonstration for anybody to see what AI does. AI has obviously been around for a long time, but it became an easy way for people to see what AI does. And I feel a little bit like, and I'm going to walk through this analogy after the break, that if you use it as a framework for kind of explaining to people what is involved with an app modernization or an app migration, the movement from somebody who is a Twitter user to potentially a Threads user aligns really well. And you may be able to use that and the fact that somebody who is a Twitter user can easily jump over, start up an account on Threads, and understand both the opportunity but also the challenge of going from something that's been pretty well established for now more than a decade. Lots of people use it, lots of people understand it, or at least have had experience with it. To move to something else, I think is going to provide a good encapsulation of how you can have a framework for conversation with anybody who says, hey, we need to modernize or migrate an existing application. So I'm going to dive into that after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Equinix. We all utilize multiple cloud providers, and we know they aren't built to work well together. Things get a whole lot more complex when your hybrid infrastructure needs to connect with your multi-cloud portfolio. Equinix is the world's digital infrastructure company, providing on-demand infrastructure in over 25 metros with hands-free provisioning and management, all connected to over 240 data centers and most major cloud providers. Equinix can help you deal with increasingly complex architectures, whether you want to run your favorite Kubernetes distribution or connect workloads between different cloud providers. To learn more, sign up at deploy.equinix.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST, CLOUDCAST, to get $500 in credits to get started today. That's deploy.equinix.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST and get those first $500 in credits today. Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive a little bit into this analogy that came to mind as I was starting to play around with the new Threads tool, application, platform, whatever you want to call it, social network. And, there was a part of me that immediately did the techie thing where, I did I kind of did a mental analysis of, okay, this is supposed to be the thing that switches you from Twitter, or you switch from this to Twitter. It's a social network. I really haven't gotten into things like Mastodon and Blue Sky. I played around with them a little bit. They were kind of mostly because the community wasn't there, and I didn't really feel like rebuilding a community and so forth. And they were kind of these weird independent things and so forth. So again, not a comment or analysis or anything on any of these other sort of Twitter clones that are popping out there. So anyways, Threads pops up, and, lots of people, apparently 50, 60, 80 million people at least experimented with it on the first couple of days, which makes sense. It's new, and people are somewhat frustrated with Twitter. So anyways, I don't want to make this about sort of an analysis of Threads. I actually don't want to make an analysis of Twitter. I did a Twitter thing a while ago on a Sunday perspective. But what sort of, as I was playing around with it more over the weekend and kind of making that mental checklist of like, okay, here's the stuff it doesn't do. And, here's kind of the state of Twitter and so forth. It kind of dawned on me that this feels like a really good kind of analogy or proof point or kind of touch point, if you will. I mean, not proof point, but touch point of, anybody that has to go through explaining to somebody else in some meaningful way, hey, I think we should modernize or migrate an application. Essentially take some sort of application that, is useful to you, makes you money, helps you run your business, makes you productive, whatever it might be. And you come to a point where you say, boy, this thing almost feels like it's doing me more harm than good. It still does certain things, but maybe the maintenance of it is difficult, or things have changed. I mean, the licensing of it has changed, or the complexity of it has increased, whatever it might be. And you start to evaluate, should we, look at something else? Should we look at an alternative, right? And I highlighted this just because I felt like, in the same vein, and I mentioned this at the top of the show, people talked about AI for a long time, and, you could watch the AWS keynote, you could play around with Google keynote. Like there was lots of different ways. If you were fairly sophisticated, maybe you wrote, you were a Python programmer, you understood APIs, you had big data sets available to you, whatever it was, you could play around with AI stuff. And obviously, if you were a data scientist, it became much more relevant to you. But when something like ChatGPT came along, all of a sudden it was like, oh, now there is an interface for the masses. And I feel like to a certain extent with Threads, as much as, other things have attempted to be a Twitter clone, they just really haven't kind of hooked on for the masses, right? There's been, fragmentation and so forth. And I feel like to a certain extent, Threads is going to be kind of the Twitter clone for the masses. Maybe it grows up and evolves into something else or whatever. But it also felt very much like, as I was going through the what works and what doesn't work, a really good analogy for maybe explaining to somebody and easily showing them kind of what is involved and what are the steps and what's the process in some sort of modernization or migration. And so I kind of made, a mental list here of, how would you go about figuring this out? How would you go about explaining it to somebody and even, talking to them about why you'd even want to consider this? And then, of course, the obvious questions of like, well, how much work would be involved? How long would it take? Are you sure this is going to work? All those kind of things. So as I started making this mental checklist, it went something like this. First it was, let's evaluate where we are today, right? So you know the thing that you have today. You know the application you have. The people in your organization understand how to use it. You understand both the good parts of it, what you appreciate about that application, but also what you dislike about it, right? Whether it's, again, maintenance or pricing or how fast it is or what you feel like it's missing or how complicated it is to add new stuff. At some point, you kind of do this mental checklist of, yes, this is what it does, and these are the things that we feel like are holding us back or slowing us down. And so when this new thing comes along, right, so something like Threads comes along, the first thing that you're probably going to do is kind of evaluate it against, well, what do you like about it? Right. And, in the case of Threads, people were like, well, it seems to have less bots. The tone of the conversation seems to be more positive than where Twitter is today. A few other things. Oh, it was really easy to sign up. It was 2 or 3 clicks. It imported your followers if you were on Instagram, which is, kind of a big selling point of what it is, because obviously Instagram is very popular, maybe not necessarily in the context of using it for business. A lot of people, use Twitter for certain business aspects of things or certain hobbies they had, but they used Instagram for other stuff. But it did have a big social graph associated with it. And, they made it very easy for you to not only pull it over, but also start giving you those things like, oh, here's other people maybe you should start following. And then obviously there's the sort of mental checklist you do of like what's missing. It doesn't do these 10 things that I used to do all the time on Twitter, and I just kind of got used to doing, right? And someday I'll make a list of what those things are, and I don't have time for that now. But that's the first thing you tend to do is you kind of go like, okay, there's this alternative. What's good about the alternative? What's bad about the alternative, right? The next thing you do is you kind of make an evaluation. Like, can it replace? Can it replace it 100%? And that's kind of the first thing you do in your mind is you're kind of explaining or trying to understand, like, could this thing just be a drop-in replacement for what we have before? And if it can't, what can or can't it replace, right? Oh, well, this will do 40% of what I need. It doesn't do the other 60%. This 40% is significantly better, right? I don't know that in the case of Threads versus Twitter, you're going to maybe necessarily go like, this is so much better, but you're probably mentally making that checklist of like, okay, what are all the things that I do today with Twitter that are useful to me or that are ease of use or whatever it is, how you maintain the social graph, whatever. And how much of that do I really need? And then you look at, well, what can't it do? And then once you figure out what can it do and what can't it do, and the next thing you are kind of typically doing, and this is probably maybe more like if you're dealing with enterprise tech, because enterprise vendors tend to lay out a roadmap for where things are going, whereas consumer technologies don't necessarily always do that. Some do, some don't. But, there's a certain element of like surprise and excitement for the new in consumer that people really appreciate. Whereas in enterprise, it's, new and exciting that you didn't plan for. Sometimes they're complicated. But anyways, you probably are going to go to look at some sort of roadmap if it's available, and you're trying to figure out like, oh, okay, well, if it doesn't do all the things I want to do, how long will it take? Are they planning to do those, right? You may find that like that thing that you love about what's there today and that's really important for you isn't planned at all, and maybe it won't ever happen, right? So you have to be able to kind of do that mental analysis of what's good, what's bad, what's there, what's not there, when will the things be there to replace the not theirs, and will they ever be there? And then you start to kind of go through the mental gymnastics of, okay, now I have a sense of both what we have today, what we like, what we don't like, what the alternative is, what the option is for the migration or the modernization, what's important to us, what are the most important things we're trying to fix with this modernization? Because if you're just simply doing it because you're like, well, it's 10 years behind, that's fine. In some cases, that is a valid thing. Maybe you're looking at it and you're going, I can't support this thing going forward. And, a lot of people are kind of talking about that in the sense of Twitter. Like, we've all lived over the last probably year or so now, or 6 months or however long it's been, on a day-to-day basis. If Twitter is important to you, going, is it going to be around tomorrow? And some days you feel like the answer to that is, oh, sure, absolutely, it'll be around tomorrow. And then there are other days because of, announcements or changes or stuff that you hear that you go like, it literally might not be here tomorrow. And so, you're kind of doing that risk assessment of, okay, how important is it for us to change, and what things are under our control and what things aren't under our control, right? So you go to, you make that list. And then you start to have to think about, okay, the cost of change, right? Because the cost of change obviously is not free. You have to think through, well, what changes do I have to make? But then you also have to think through, what does a realistic modernization or migration look like? Like, there will be a period of time where you will probably have to deal with both systems, because again, unless that is a complete drop-in replacement feature for feature, it gives you all the things you want to do, you're going to adapt your workflows to the new capabilities of the new system, warts and all, lack of workflows or lack of capabilities and all. You're probably going to have to deal with two systems for some period of time, right? You're going to kind of go, system A does these things, system B does those things. Maybe you can integrate them, but most likely you're just going to have to deal with them as like two separate things. Right, like two tabs on a browser, if you will. And so you have to think about, like, how long will that take? What are the costs of doing that? How do I adjust my organization to be able to deal with that? And so in the case of threads and whatever, you're going, okay, I'm going to use threads for some period of time. I'm going to keep looking at Twitter because it's probably got a bigger user base that you're used to, or social graph that you're used to. And potentially you're looking at it going, oh, well, I didn't realize that Instagram was such an important part of it. It's sort of a tied-in component. I better start getting better at how I use Instagram in the context of what I used to do with Twitter, right? So you're going to, in the short term, typically add more work to your plate than you expected, right? So we lived through that. And then the next thing that you're probably going through, and I know I'm going through this because I don't spend a lot of time actively using Instagram other than like looking at stuff. My kids do stuff with it. It, to a certain extent, felt like more of a watching application. But there are lots of creative uses on there. Certain people and brands, use Twitter and Instagram and others very interchangeably. It wasn't something that I necessarily did. And so I think, there's an analogy there of, it's an app, we can figure it out, but there's a learning curve to it. There's a learning curve to figure out what are the different components of it and how long will that learning curve take? Are you prepared to find a way to teach people, right? Which number of your users, which parts of your users, which of your users are going to adapt to the learning curve? Which ones are going to be easy to train? Which ones are going to be difficult to train? Which ones don't adapt well to change? What's the cost of doing that? Are you going to have to build and create all the training yourself? Are you going to be able to easily find examples of that on YouTube? And so, the learning curve, the cost of the learning curve, the cost of retraining, the frustration that you're going to create either with your user base because you're going to create a new interface or with your users and your administrators and so forth. What is that going to look like? Now, the next thing, and this is probably the most important thing, both in this sort of Twitter and threads thing, evolution, migration, is what about all the users? What about really, I guess, sort of all the data that's associated with the application, whether it's users, followers, people you follow, lists that you've made to curate what's going on, ways in which data is managed, like hashtags and so forth. And just the data itself, you're like, oh, I've been really creative. I've created 10,000 interesting tweets and videos and so forth. Well, they're all sort of locked in that other platform. The same way that in a current application, the data is somewhat associated with that current application. And so what a lot of people are trying to figure out in the, Twitter to Threads migration or even Instagram to Threads migration is how much of that am I going to be able to reuse? And how much of that am I going to be starting from scratch? And so, there's a lot of people that are trying to figure out, how does that work? Are there any tools to help with that? Am I going to have to just start going and curating my own community, my own follower list, all those sort of things? And the data piece of it is huge because not only do you not want to blow up the old data, you may have regulations or retention requirements around it. And then you got to figure out the translation-ness of it, how much of it can just be moved, how much of it will work the same, how much of it has to start over. You start getting into really simple things like, in the case of Twitter and Threads, like, I follow this person. I'm sure their name is, like why would they have a different name over on Instagram as they do on Twitter? And I'm starting to find there are lots of people that don't keep the same name or handle or whatever between different services. And again, there's probably lots of reasons for that. But, that could be the simplest thing of like, oh, this old application stores names as last name, comma, first name. And the new application stores them as first name, comma, last name. And so you'd have to figure out, well, how do I translate those things? Are there any limitations? Maybe you are like, oh, we don't really have any limitations on, or this old application has a limit on the number of characters or the number of the way in which characters are kept in the database. And maybe you want to move into new markets and you're like, oh, if I'm going into certain Asian markets or African markets or South American markets or whatever, where maybe the last names or the full name or the family name is oftentimes longer because they include more, history within the name, you may have a problem with that. So again, thinking about the data migrations, how much translates, how much moves, how easy is it going to be? Those are all a huge piece of what goes on. And then the last question that you probably are asking yourself, and a lot of people are asking themselves, there's a million articles being written about it this weekend, is, will this be successful? Like, it's great that you have all these plans about how you're going to do it and how you're going to think about it and how you're going to structure it and so on and so forth. But a lot of times your boss, your colleague, yourself, up front, you may ask the question like, I'm going to go do a lot of work to do this. And I understand that there's a risk that the old one might fall over someday, or there's a risk that, you can't figure out the new thing. But people often just want to know, like, is this going to work? What assurances can you give me that this is going to work? Like, I don't want to hear about how the sausage is going to be made. I don't want to hear about how it could take you 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or how many dollars. They sometimes just want to know, like, bottom line, is this going to work? Because it's important. And I need something to be, this function in the business, right? Maybe, you think about this and you go, oh, I use Twitter for marketing kinds of purposes or information gathering, competitive intelligence purposes or whatever it might be. And they just want to know, like, am I going to have a system that does that? Because today I do have a system that does that, warts and all. Am I going to have a system that does that in the future? Because if the new one isn't going to exist, I don't care how cool and new it is. Like, if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, not like 80% good or whatever, like maybe it's not going to be there. And I think ultimately that's the question people are asking themselves or has been asking themselves over the last few months as Twitter has declined or gone through changes, and they've seen a Blue Sky come along or a Mastodon come along or whatever other tools are out there. And to a certain extent, there's been a lot of like, well, I would leave Twitter, but I don't think these other ones are good. Like, I don't think they're going to exist at all. I think part of that conversation is going away, or that risk or concern is going away with Threads, because it is backed by a gigantic company, Facebook, Meta, but B, it's backed by people who know how to build the infrastructure and the systems for huge, large, connected social networks. And, you can have whatever thoughts you want about Facebook or Meta or Instagram or, their politics or their data privacy or, whatever else you may like or dislike about the company or the individuals behind it. But if you think about it in terms of, how risk averse am I that this is going to succeed? I think the odds of that are probably pretty good, probably considerably better than any of these smaller startups, given that they already have a built-in revenue stream. They already have a built-in advertisement base. Twitter sort of proved that, you can't just run the service to run the service. It has to involve advertisement. It has to involve scale and all these other sort of things. The competitive one that's come along, i.e. Threads, already knows how to do all those things. Now, there's a very good chance, and who knows that, I don't say a good chance, there is a chance that they do it wrong. Things go wrong. Copying something is never necessarily easy, right? You don't get all the institutional knowledge that comes with copying user interface. But this is, again, the same sort of, maybe biggest question that people will ask you in terms of doing a migration or a modernization is like, is it going to work? Period. Point blank, black and white, yes or no, is this going to work? And I think there's a kind of a strong analogy you can draw to what people are thinking about, like, should I invest my time, effort, skills, blood, sweat, and tears, if you will, in something like Threads, or do I just ride out what we have in place today? So anyways, hopefully that's a useful framework as you're thinking about like, how would I explain to somebody beyond just, hey, this old thing is old, it kind of sucks, it's slow, maintaining it's expensive. Like, how can I frame this and how can I use an analogy that somebody can touch and feel to explain this modernization piece? And so I hope this kind of framework is helpful to you. Hopefully you can adapt it to the environments that you're getting into. And I know there's probably lots of other people that would love us to do shows on like, hey, take a common Java application and walk me through what it would be like to migrate it from a VMware environment on-prem into an AWS environment. And we'll try and do those shows as we can, find good guests for that. But anyways, I wanted to use this analogy because it seemed pretty straightforward. It did seem like something you could touch and feel and potentially pass along to others who may not necessarily be as technically inclined or as wrapped up in the day-to-day as you might be in an application, and whether or not you should migrate it or modernize it. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody is enjoying their weekend, enjoying July. It is probably very hot wherever you live, at least if you live in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, maybe not so much. But it is crazy hot here. So anyways, hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying cool. Happy birthday to my dad. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks for listening to the show. Thanks for helping us grow the community. Thanks for telling a friend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.